the feeling of the meeting last week was it was like a funeral, as if they just buried a family member, and the family member they buried was Ukraine. The NATO members tried to revive their spirits by saying, all right, let's prepare for the next great fight against China. And China is now designated as the ultimate strategic enemy, #1 of the United States and of Europe. So what we're really seeing in Ukraine and what the NATO meeting said was, that's only the first battle in what's going to be a many generations war against China. One reason that we've scheduled the speech for today is we wanted to wait until there was the NATO meeting in Vilnius that was going to spell out exactly where they're going to go from here. And the feeling of the meeting last week was it was like a funeral, as if they just buried a family member, and the family member they buried was Ukraine. The Ukrainians are left only with terrorist means of fighting. And NATO has actually run out of arms. They've used 50 years of stored up weaponry of guns and helicopters and tanks. They've all been thrown in, essentially emptied out, and there's nothing more that the Ukraine can do. It's drafting people. It goes out on the street to begin to draft people. And obviously the war there is over. And the whole last year and a half of NATO's and America's attempt to drive Russia out of Ukraine and move NATO right up to Russian borders is a failure. And so what were they going to do in Vilnius? Well, the NATO members tried to revive their spirits by saying, all right, let's prepare for the next great fight against China. And China is now designated as the ultimate strategic enemy, #1 of the United States and of Europe. And to prepare for this showdown, NATO announced a commitment that they were going to spread their military presence all the way to the Pacific. There's really nothing for NATO to do anymore on the Atlantic. And it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It now says we're going to relocate NATO in the Straits of China. Just as Radica said, they had planned to fight to the last Ukrainian. They're hoping that maybe the Taiwanese will be willing to fight China to the last Taiwanese and basically slow what seems to be inevitable. The fact that China, Russia, the BRICS partners, along with the global South, are all creating their own unit independently of the United States and NATO. Well, the NATO plan that was announced a few weeks ago is they're trying to carve away China's military allies and trading partners, above all Russia, by fighting in the Ukraine. They expected that Russia was actually going to lose in the Ukraine, despite having a 10-to-1 advantage in troops and in arms and basically strength. Well, President Biden said, we'll turn the ruble to rubble. But he also said that since the fight in the Ukraine against Russia is really a fight over what kind of economy the world system is going to have, this is going to take many decades. So what we're really seeing in Ukraine and what the NATO meeting said was, that's only the first battle in what's going to be a many generations war against China. And because they realized that other countries until now, from the Bandung Conference of Third World countries in the 1950s, 70 years ago, other countries didn't have the ability to be self-sufficient in food, in basic productions. But now that the United States has very helpfully shifted its manufacturing power to China and other Asian countries, now the rest of the world doesn't need subservience to the United States anymore. It can go it alone. And this is what is so upsetting to the United States. Well, Radeke has explained initially about how the United States benefited enormously from the trade with China. When President Clinton admitted China into the World Trade Organization in 2000, the plan was to replace American labor with low-priced Asian labor and Chinese labor. The objective of free trade was to reduce employment in the United States, to cause unemployment, which would lower the wages of labor. And by lowering the wages of labor and the living standards, this would make American companies more profitable. They'd be more profitable because they would now be using the cheap labor of China and other Asian countries instead of the United States. So it looked like a win-win for the corporations in the United States who were, and the Democratic Party that President Clinton was the head of basically represents Wall Street and the corporate economy, not labor. There is no party in the United States that really supports labor. So the idea is now, how is the United States going to continue to siphon off all of the wealth of other countries in itself? It deindustrialized. It's basically lost its financial power. The world is moving into dependence on its other. This is exactly what has led the United States to say, we can't let the world change this way, or if it is going to change this way, at least we can slow it down. And one thing that the last year and a half have shown in the fighting in Ukraine is that the United States has been able to beat one set of countries, the NATO countries. NATO now has to spend an enormous amount of money replacing all of its the arms that it's used up in Ukraine. Who's going to get the business? American military industrial complex, Raytheon and other countries. The expectation is that the US balance of payments at least will, in currency, will rise against the euro. And the war, instead of destroying Russia, has turned Western Europe, Germany and others, into a dead zone. Well, that's not the way they're describing it. The European Union Commissioner, Joseph Borrell, says, yes, the world is splitting into two parts. Germany and Europe is the garden. The US and NATO part of the world is the dollar area, is the garden. The rest of the world is the jungle. What Borrell didn't say is that there's a gardener to a garden. You can't have a garden without a gardener who comes and picks all the crops. The United States is the gardener for the European garden. And the problem is, how are they going to relate to the jungle that is actually treated like an invasive species? Well, from an economic point of view, NATO from the very beginning has been a drastic error. It's left Europe in, it destroyed European industry with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, and the sanctions against Russia have really been sanctions against Europe. Russia has been able to export its oil, its minerals, its food. The only countries that have been sanctioned are the NATO countries, which are blocked from trading with Russia. And they're now saying, we want to prevent Europe from trading with China as well. And the amazing thing is that the Europeans seem to be going along with it. And what we're seeing is a replacement of how traditionally people have analyzed geopolitical economy. The whole idea or assumption under most analysis, if you're making a study of how is the world going to evolve, you assume that countries are going to follow their economic self-interest. But that's not happening. NATO and NATO countries in Europe are following US interests, but not their own interests. They're actually sacrificing their economy in order to fight against Russia. They've replaced the economic causality of history with what they call national security considerations. not economic gains, national security. National security means the American security, and the Americans feel very insecure if there are other countries that are independent of the United States. When China began to saying, we're glad to create factories and manufacture, we're glad to provide employment and make enough money to build up our international reserves and become strong, but we're going to use the Chinese wealth to increase the living standards of the Chinese population and to increase China's productive powers, to increase the size and the balance of the Chinese economy, not the American economy. The American dream in the early 2000s was that Wall Street firms would go over to China and saying, let us organize your industry. We'll organize corporations in China. We'll be the major owners of it, and all the profits that are going to be made from this Chinese industrial employment will be sent back to investors in the United States, just like the United States had planned to do with Russian industry in the 1990s under Yeltsin. But China didn't have a Boris Yeltsin. They actually put their own interest first, and this is what is upset the United States so much. So you've seen NATO not only deplete its whole inventories of guns and bullets and artillery and tanks and helicopters, but they've, without Russian gas, they've had to close down their heavy industry. How can you make steel without using fuel, oil and gas to melt it? How can you have an industry without gas and energy? And if you look at the economic growth of any country for thousands of years, the energy per worker is what explains the rise in productivity and the rise in living standards. You'd think that Europe would have said, well, we need energy in order to grow. Our interest lies in closer and closer relationships with Russia, China, and the parts of the world that are growing. Well, that was the dream. And this is what they've been willing to forego. European business was investing in Russia, investing in Kazakhstan, Central Asia, investing in China, and all of a sudden they're directed by NATO to say, you have to stop that investment over there. You have to treat America as your supplier of gas at 6 times the price of Russian gas, and you have to build new ports for liquid natural gas, LNG, to import our gas, American gas, instead of Russian gas. You should reorganize your whole policy along national security lines. And remember, it's a jungle out there. And when Borrell said it's a jungle, he means it's very dangerous to move to countries outside of the US neoliberal sphere. And it's certainly dangerous for politicians, because the United States has been meddling in European politics for the last 70 years to make sure that political leaders are basically follow the US plan for how economies should be organized in ways to benefit the United States. So by joining America's crusade to destroy the Russian economy and promote regime change, Germany and other countries have really cut off their economic growth. Their economy last year has shrunk. And the way that the euro is organized as a monetary system, it was designed in the United States by the University of Chicago, so that despite the rise in unemployment, despite the huge need for subsidizing gas prices in Europe so that families will have enough, can afford to heat their homes or air condition their homes, all of this is subordinated to national security, meaning the new war of the NATO countries, the golden billion of English speakers and Western Europeans against the global majority. that is being driven to act by itself just to maintain its own economic growth. So the next step is for Europe and the United States to stop trading and investing in China. Well, the amazing thing is that in the last few months, American diplomats have gone to China and said, and asked them, actually, won't you support us against Russia? Won't you tell Russia to stop fighting in Ukraine so that we can rearm the Ukrainians and have the Polish army move up to the Russian border? They've actually asked China to help separate itself from Russia, which at the same time, America opposes Russia because of its support with China. Well, obviously, China has, President Xi has announced that China is a strategic ally, even though it would like to see peace in Ukraine. It is not crying for the fact that, well, if there's going to be military fighting, it's better for China that it occurs in Western Europe than in the China Sea. So ironically, this isolation of other countries, this announcement of a long-term war against China and Russia is forcing China, Russia, and the BRICS allies to go it alone with united Eurasia. And the new core is being created that has its own principles. And these principles of economic growth are different from the United States. The United States forward planning is done by Wall Street firms. Finance is the major planner of the economy today. And that's part of what people have difficulty understanding. The fight that you're seeing today is sometimes said, well, it's between capitalism and socialism, the capitalist West versus socialist China and its allies. But the problem is, what is capitalism? It's not what it used to be. Industrial capitalism was very much aimed at evolving into socialism. Industrial capitalism, the way that the United States got rich, Germany rose to industrial power, and even England was doing pretty much what China has been doing for the last 30 years. It was the industrial capitalists that said, we want governments to play a major role. We want government to provide basic infrastructure. We want government to provide free education, free healthcare, and we want governments to take over natural monopolies like railroads and buses and transportation, because if we can lower the cost of living, then that lowers the cost of doing business. Because if the government provides education and other basic needs freely or at subsidized prices, then employers do not have to pay labor a high enough wage so that it has to pay for its own health care. It has to pay for its own education. It has to go into to a lifetime of debt in order to get a university degree in the United States. It has to pay enormous medical overhead costs. This is not industrial capitalism anymore. This is finance capitalism. The government support of the economy that every industrial economy used in its takeoff has now been financialized and privatized. And that's what makes the Europe and the United States economies different from China. And this is why they would love to make money from China by selling all of its infrastructure, selling its railroads, privatizing them, privatizing everything that they could in order to create monopolies and to charge monopoly rent. The conflict between America and China is that of finance capitalism versus an industrial socialism, you could call it in China, because the final stage of industrialization already in the 19th century was seen to be socialism. That's what, there were many different kinds of socialism that people talked about, but at least the idea was that capitalism is evolving into socialism. But in the United States and Europe, that is now fighting back. The landlord class and the financial class have fought back to reverse the whole role of industrial capitalism as a reform, as a policy of getting rid of the landlord class, getting rid of the banking class, getting rid of monopolies. all of that is out in the West, and the result is that the West is in a position of shrinking. So you can see what America was frightened about. When it saw Western Europe trade and invest more with Russia and China, it worried it was going to be left out. And what could it do? It thought, well, if we can have a war against Russia, we can, the people will rise up and overthrow Putin and put a more friendly, US-friendly leader like Boris Yeltsin in, and then we can do the same to China. We can impose sanctions on China, prevent it from importing sophisticated computer chips and blocking its growth, and it'll have no choice but to say, okay, stop the sanctions, you won, we're going to adopt a US-style economy. And obviously, that hasn't worked in the Ukraine-Russia war so far. And the question is whether it's going to work in China. Well, how on earth are you going to get the Europeans to stop their trade and investment with China? Well, the answer was in a series of speeches in the last few weeks, including when US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen went to China. They say the shape of world trade is no longer going to be trade with the most efficient countries and buying at the lowest prices in the most productive market. Any form of trade, Janet Yellen explained to China, is a risk. It's the risk of being cut off and destabilized. So the Americans have said, well, when you Russians thought that you were benefiting from buying inexpensive Russian gas and oil and titanium and helium and other inputs, but everything, trade, all this was a risk. It's a risk that Russia and China might suddenly stop trading with you and destabilize you and try to gain control by saying, we're going to turn off our gas, or China will turn off the computers it makes and all the manufactured goods that it makes. The warning was that any trade with China is by definition a risk. And Germany's foreign minister, Annalise Baerbock, said the same thing. Trade is a risk. What they don't realize is that why on earth would Russia or China say, let's destabilize Europe. Let's all of a sudden stop exporting to it. Let's not export anything more, and let's wreck the economy unless they do what we, the Chinese, want to do. Well, why would they do it? The world is already doing what China wants to do, because China has shaped its trade, shaped its international investment in a way that benefits the entire economy. What the United States has done is say, when it says trade is risk, is trade with anybody except the United States is risk. There's no recognition that European trade with the United States is risks being cut off by American sanctions. And since 1945, the only country that's imposed sanctions on other countries is the United States, not Russia, not China, not other countries. Right after China's revolution, the United States tried to overthrow Mao by imposing sanctions on grain. The attempt was to starve China and force a counter-revolution against Mao. Canada helped break the sanctions and sent grain to China. It's no longer a friend of China, but it was back then. So the United States is projecting its own policy as if China and Russia wanted to dominate other countries by wrecking them. And the only way that the United States can achieve power over countries is to destabilize them with sanctions. But the other countries have no reason to destabilize Europe or to impose sanctions. They have nothing to defend. There was a mutual gain between Europe and Russia and Europe and China with their organization together. And now that that's pulled out, this leaves the United States and Europe basically isolated, and China and the Eurasia and the global South and the BRICS together now say, well, we are the center of world manufacturing power. We're the center of the world's population. We're the center of world raw materials. We're the center of agricultural production. If the United States can sanction us, that is a warning to us that we need to be self-sufficient so that we don't have to be dependent on any other country again. And just like the United States said, well, we can disrupt your financial system by cutting you off from the bank clearing system, the SWIFT system. China and Russia have each created their own financial system to be independent. There's no need for an interdependency anymore. The US and NATO plan for a unipolar world has failed, and the world that China, Russia, India, Iran, and the BRICS are creating with the global South is a multilateral world where there is mutual gain, not exploitation. And the trade as risk view, over the long run, will have to yield to basic economic interests. Well, the problem is, what can the United States do to stop this? The United States can't fight militarily. There's never going to be an American army again since the Vietnam War ended the draft. All it can do is have proxy armies fighting. It was able to stage a color revolution in Ukraine, make a coup d'etat, turn Ukraine over to the Nazis, who revived all of the World War II hatred of Russia, the old Nazi anti-Russian policy, and they were able at least to tie up Russia there. It's unlikely that it can do the same with Taiwan because what does America have to offer Taiwan? Taiwan can have a close economic relationship with China, with mutual trade and investment in a growing economy. Or it can link to the American economy and indeed find a US market for its information technology, its computer chips. But the American economy is now shrinking, as the European economies are. So you're having two parts of the world, a shrinking NATO US part, the garden, and the growing part, the jungle. That's what jungles do. They grow more than the garden, and they don't have a gardener to take off all of their surplus. So you're having really the final evolution in Asia, in China and the other countries of what the world was expected to evolve into at the point that World War I began. We're now picking up history again. We're under Chinese leadership, Russian leadership, and other countries, they're finally getting rid of the rentier class, getting rid of the hereditary landlord class, getting rid of the hereditary banking class, because China and other countries are keeping control of the money and financial planning in government hands, not borrowing from a financial creditor class to fund growth, but creating your own money to creating their own growth. That's why the Bank of China has been the driving force in Chinese economic expansion, not leaving it to US investors to plan China in its own self-interest. So that basically we're seeing the failure of the United States to carve out an empire in the way that it had hoped to do. And you can say that the growth of China, Russia, and the BRICS allies are the alternative to imperialism, the alternative to empire, replacing imperialism, the empire, with mutual gains.